Hey guys, a lot of people have been asking for an update to armor and weapon tier lists and stuff like that, and seeing as our next major update is probably sometime in the fall, it's maybe not a bad idea to update you guys until then. Remember that all tier lists look for function over fashion or fun. It is about the kind of power these exotics can generate for you. This list also only takes items that are at year 2 power levels into consideration. For those of you just looking for a quick overview, here it is. Generally speaking, nothing drastic happened. Let's start with Warlocks. Introduced in patch 2.2 were Sunbreakers and Purifier robes. Sunbreakers got a buff in that now you get an extra grenade in addition to its effects of boosting the duration of Solar Grenade. So does that really make a difference? Well, Touch of Flame is kinda nice for PvP purposes, and Solar Grenade is nice to plant on objectives, but Firebolts feel like they're still the most popular choice. In PvE, Solar Grenade is pretty good for planting where you know enemies are going to spawn, and can also be used for zoning purposes, but even then, they're nothing over the top. Using Solar Grenades does not make or break your PvE experience too often. The fact that you now get a second grenade isn't too influential because Gift of the Sun was already a really strong pick in that column of bonuses if you're not picking Firebolt. In general, these get a 2.5 or so. Not terrible enough to be considered bad, but not good enough to be considered in the top tier of items, just dead in the middle. Purifier robes, also a Sunsinger focused exotic, blinds, technically disorients, nearby enemies when you self-res using Fireborn. These were hot when they first came out last year, but as more and more people realized that you probably shouldn't stand near dead Sunsingers, ever, their use became less and less popular, not to mention that this is an exotic that requires you to be dead in order for it to be useful. In PvE, the damage reduction on Radiance is usually more than enough to make sure you get out of a bad situation safely. In PvP, it requires very good timing and an unaware opponent to be useful, but in its most useful place, Trials of Osiris, teams are usually wary of the Sunsinger, and sometimes you might not even get to use a self-res because you don't have your super. In general, these get around a 1.5 to a 2 pretty much everywhere. It's a cool gimmick, but it's a gimmick that requires you to be dead, a state you should probably avoid being in. Skull of Dire AHAMKARA managed to sort of sneak its way back into the game despite it technically being in the game because of what I think was an accidental sell by Xur. Anyway, with the skull, you take reduced damage while in your Nova Bomb animation, and you also gain enhanced energy drain effects. Unfortunately, these effects don't stack with the hunger, so that's kind of a bummer, and doesn't really make me want to use this helm over Nothing Manacles for an energy drain build. Annihilate isn't really that important in PvE, and neither is Angry Magic, so the hunger is already the smartest pick you can make in that column, and Skull of Dire AHAMKARA basically gives you the hunger for free. I want those 2 grenades from Nothing Manacles more than the damage reduction in my Nova Bomb animation. In PvP, it's basically the same deal. I want the grenades more than I want Annihilate and reduced damage on bombs if I'm running an energy drain build. If you want the opposite of that, then this will serve you better than it'll serve me. I don't think I could go higher than a 2.5 for this in most activities, and that 2.5 is pretty generous. I personally think it's a 1.5 or a 2. Nothing Manacles have skyrocketed up the PvE charts to a 4.5 to a 5 because of the new buffs to energy drain, plus the fact that it got a little bit of its tracking power back. With 2 scatter grenades, Nothing Manacles are an excellent option for Voidwalkers in PvE. In PvP, they are an absolute menace, and netting a kill with an energy drain build just gives you another grenade for free. They honestly could be considered a 4.5 in PvP as well. They are really good, and are one of the few grenades to actually kill with a well-placed throw. If people wanted to give Obsidian Mind a bump up in PvE because of the new buffs to energy drain, I'd be willing to hear those arguments, but I really don't think it needs to move at all. A lot of people were not happy with my rating of the Impossible Machines at 3.5. In retrospect, I probably should have gone a little bit higher with them, and for this list I will. However, the blinding effect of landfall was nerfed to not exist, and the damage was reduced as well by 17%. Despite all that, these basically remain as the PvE option for Stormcallers, with Claws of AHAMKARA potentially swiping the PvP spot now with no more blinding effect on landfall. These are still totally fine as a PvP option though. Otherwise, nothing else has received any buffs or nerfs, and therefore stay around where I ranked them in the previous video. You can find the tier list rankings on all of the other exotics, not just for Warlocks, but for everything, in the description in both video and graph form. Hunters, you guys got 3 returning exotics: ATS-8 Arachnid, KHEPRI'S Sting, and Lucky Raspberry. The ATS-8 Arachnid was one of the worst exotic hunter items in the game for a while. It got a buff with its return, where your golden gun now lasts longer, in addition to it zooming in your golden gun when you aim down sights. Was that buff enough to do anything for this helm on the tier list? Pretty much no, especially considering the symbiote got a buff to give you a couple of extra seconds back using golden gun. It basically got unnerfed. Only on the biggest of PvP maps is this really considered, and even then you don't need it. I don't care what kind of extra stuff it's capable of doing. Essentially, no one is going to use this over the Nighthawk in PvE or the symbiote in PvP. It's just not going to happen. It gets at best a 2 on larger PvP maps, and less than that everywhere else. KHEPRI'S Sting is a really interesting exotic with almost no utility at all. Crouching makes you invisible for a short time, and melee attacks deal 4 times the damage while invisible when attacking from behind, and also leaves damage over time, with the effect not stacking with backstab for probably good reason. It's cool, but when am I going to use this? I originally thought it might have been useful for Prison of Elders challenge score runs for melee kills, but considering that throwing knives award precision kill points in addition to melee points, using these for a high score isn't as good. Otherwise, I don't think I've seen these used by anyone for anything besides using them for light levels. It's a very interesting concept, and it's a really cool concept, but it's one that leaves you very vulnerable, which takes a while to set up and doesn't leave you with much payoff compared to just shooting your target. Most low and mid-tier enemies die with 1 or 2 melees, and by the time you set up for a backstab, you probably could have just killed your target. Finally, Lucky Raspberry makes its return, spawning you with full grenade energy, and has your arc bolt chain farther. In year 1, this was really solid because arc bolts dealt a lot more damage than they do now. Nowadays, it feels like Skip Grenade has taken over as the premier Blade Dancer grenade. If you still use arc bolt, then this can serve you pretty well, but the ATS-8 Tarantella just feels like a more well-rounded Blade Dancer exotic, buffing a lot of aspects of the subclass as opposed to just one. Getting returning grenade energy is pretty good for trials, but otherwise isn't that impressive. In PvE, it is also pretty lackluster, although Blade Dancer as a PvE subclass is pretty lackluster as well, so that certainly doesn't help. As mentioned earlier, the Acleophage symbiote got a little bit of an unnerf, where some time was restored back to the golden gun timer when using this helm. Given that this really wasn't a PvE problem and more of a PvP problem, it gets a bump up in PvP. Titans got 3 exotics from year 1 brought back in the April update. Unfortunately, none of them are really that good. The ACD-0 feedback fence is probably the most interesting of the bunch, where taking damage from a melee attack damages everything around you. It's a cool concept for an exotic, but in practice doesn't really help as much as I was hoping it would. It's an exotic that requires you to take damage in order for it to work, something you really don't want to be doing in PvE. Anything it can be killed very easily with some punching or shooting, and anything that it can't kill will probably only have one of it around, like a knight or something. However, it does enable you to get kills in PvP when you are hit by a melee attack, assuming you retaliate with an attack of your own. Is that something worth utilizing over, say, an extra grenade or the mobility of Twilight Garrison? Personally, I don't think so. Something tangible is going to serve you much better than having to rely on taking damage. Maybe if the damage was a big nuke on a considerable cooldown, to where it would annihilate some stuff around you, almost like a mini Fist of Havoc-like explosion, that would be cooler, but as it stands, it's nothing really too special. Eternal Warrior gives you Unstoppable for Fist of Havoc for free. That's it. You'll be able to survive much more stuff than you typically would, and you'll be able to get Shoulder Charge at the same time, or Juggernaut. This helm is not really that impressive, although I can certainly see the appeal for highly aggressive players who want to shoulder charge or skate around. Having Unstoppable will allow you to skate into high traffic areas to set up for a smash, while also being able to take a little more damage as the super is going off. Is that worth it? I really don't think so. In PvE, it is a complete non-factor. Finally, the Glass House extends the duration of Blessing and Weapons of Light. Unfortunately, this helm comes just short of being really good in PvE. Unfortunately, again, it feels like any other buff to it might make it a permanent staple, not really offering too many choices. Something like giving this helm Illuminated for free or further increasing the benefit of Blessing or Weapons would make it really powerful, maybe too much so. King's Fall doesn't really require this helm's services because most of the time you and your team are going to be close enough to a ward that you can simply refresh the buff on your own without too much hassle. Blessing of Light duration doesn't really matter as much as strength, although Weapons certainly sees a benefit. I might be underselling this helm, but I don't think it's anything that remarkable. In PvP, it can really be useful making it so you don't need to visit your ward as often, assuming you're using weapons, but chances are you're going to be sticking by it for protection, although it's definitely nice for your teammates. It has a very specific use, and if you can find that specific use, then great, but generally speaking, it's not something that's in very high demand.